Now you can open your Bible. A number of us gathered at 6:04 this morning. In fact, there were almost exactly 12 of us, which I thought was spiritually very significant and symbolic. There was 13, but if I was counting without myself, 12. The most 12, devoted people in our church. No, I'm joking. No, it was great. We enjoyed that service this morning. And it began the day out right because today is actually a party day, which is why we gave the kids little disco balls. This all ties together, and I'll explain in just a second. But before I do, I want to read a text that doesn't feel quite so much like a party, and it immediately follows Jesus' resurrection. So we're going to hear a little bit of a dissonance here, but I want you to feel this together. Luke chapter 24, verse 36. While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them, speaking of the disciples, and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your heart? Look at my hands and my feet, and see that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. A little bit anticlimactic, wouldn't you say? Anybody have something to eat? Here's a piece of broiled fish. Thanks? John 20, again, a little bit of dissonance here. John 20, verse 24. But Thomas, who is called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came, so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails on my hand on his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet come to believe." Again, a little bit of a dissonance here. Jesus has risen from the dead. That's where the narrative has taken us. It feels like it should be a huge celebration, and yet the reality of what's happening is there's still a lot of doubt and disbelief. First of all, with the disciples who literally saw Jesus, the text says they still were disbelieving and struggling in their hearts. And then specifically with this dude Thomas, who's like, "I'm not believing, I don't care what you all said, until I see it with my own eyes." Now, this collides a little bit with the title of our sermon this morning, The Resurrection After Party Scenario. So, this was what you might call a resurrection after party, all these texts I read. It wasn't the party, you got that vibe, right? Nobody was dancing and celebrating. The disco balls, the Jewish disco balls, that is, weren't going, in circles or anything. No. There was doubt. There was broiled fish. There was people having conversations about what had happened. There was the disciples in fear, being startled by Jesus. Things that we all experienced to some degree. So I want to make a couple opening comments about parties in general. First of all, we all understand that significance events usually are followed by cool parties. Is that not correct? birthdays, anniversaries, National Coffee Day, winning some big sports championship or award or prize, National Coffee Day, National Espresso Day, National Whole Bean Roasting Day, and the list goes on. These significant occasions call for a cool party. And if you think about it, what we celebrate today is the most significant day in the history of the church. Without the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus, all our songs and services, all our worship and witness, all our prayers and practices are pointless. That's basically what the individual who wrote half the New Testament said, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 19. He said, if this is all we have and the resurrection isn't reality, the bodily resurrection of Jesus and his people isn't a literal reality, then we are of all men most miserable. And he's right. So Resurrection Day for the church has always been our biggest party day, you might say. Now, the way we party on this annual occasion is typically in worshiping form. You understand that, right? We sing and pray and preach and proclaim the glory of the resurrection, and we call that a party because that's what it is. You are literally this morning at the church's biggest party of the year, Resurrection Day. So welcome. But let's push this party idea a bit more. All the best parties that I know of have even cooler after parties. At least that's what I'm told. I wouldn't actually know because I've never been invited to one. Maybe it's because I've never been to a party that was so big that it needed an after party. I'm hoping one day to be of something that is so one of a kind, and without an after party, it wouldn't seem right. Now, I want you to think about this idea of the biggest party the church celebrates and has celebrated for the last 2,000 years, and the dissonance between that and the after party we have with Jesus and his disciples. These after parties that Jesus kind of shows up, and they're kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? And there's doubt, and there's broiled fish, and there's all these strange things happening. So a few questions come to mind as we think about these texts. The first question I have is, where is the party when you have nothing left? I realize it's kind of a strange question, but it gets to the heart of the human predicament. And by the way, that's every single one of you in here, if you're human. We're all good at being the life of the party when our life is going well, right? But when life seems to squeeze all the joy from our bones and leave us a shriveled up version of ourselves emotionally, physically, financially, relationally, or even spiritually, well, the last thing we want to do is party, right? And maybe that's your frustration today. You came to church with people that seem to be far too happy for their own good. Or maybe it's more that than you just being annoyed with overly energetic people. Maybe it's a deeper sense of anger or sorrow at the way your life is going with no apparent pathway out. I love singer and songwriter Joy, and I can't pronounce her last name, so I won't even try, but she has a song called Somehow. An explicit language notwithstanding, I love the line where she sings, "Life can change with the weather, oh, sometimes things just get better." And I understand, although what she's saying, and I like what she's saying, and I even take personal comfort in it, but for the reality of many people here, life just doesn't get better, if we're honest. The job keeps getting worse, the ex-best friend doesn't apologize, the cancer doesn't stay in remission, and the list goes on. So here you are on possibly the worst day for you to be at church. The day that the church is at its happiest. Do any of you feel this tension? I'm not saying you should have stayed home. Please, I'm thankful you're here. I just want you to understand that if you feel a little removed or even upset by the worship and the hoopla, it's okay. This is the human predicament. Or maybe it's just that all this celebration is confusing given our cultural moment, when so many people are suffering in so many ways and you feel helpless to make a difference. And all the typical church Easter joy that seems at a dissonance with all that's going on in our country and our world bothers you. That's okay too. This is the human predicament that we are all in. If that's where you find yourself today, just know that you're not alone. In fact, I imagine we could do some on-the-street interviews here this morning. We'll call them in-the-pew interviews, of course. But I suspect that we'll find that even the most joyful people here today are heavy with their own personal sorrows and helpless outrage with so many movements in our social, political, religious moment today. It's just the reality. So I'd say to you, it's okay to feel the way you feel, and I imagine it even corresponds in many ways to the way in which Jesus' closest followers felt in the wake of his death on the cross. The whole vibe of the men and women who had been Jesus' disciples up to his crucifixion was the complete opposite of a party atmosphere. The followers of Jesus were stumbling for traction. They were fumbling with words to describe their sense of loss, their sense of being duped, or of being on the wrong side of the power game, of the pointlessness of it all, the confusion, the doubt, the sorrow. It was no party for them, to be sure. And even after they were confronted by the reality of Jesus' physical resurrection, I imagine they were in a bit of shock. As we know, not all of them even believed the report at first. So even after the resurrection event, there was still confusion, fear, disbelief in Jesus' closest friends and allies. Yet the followers of Jesus could not forget. They had staked everything on the fact that this one was the true Messiah and more. They had been with him. They had seen him do godlike things. They had watched him confront the powers of religion and state from a seemingly upside-down vantage point and tie them into knots. They knew Jesus was special. They knew he was the most wonderful human that had ever walked the earth, and they knew he was more. He was so much more. And yet, here they were still weeping, some now cursing, some staring off into the nothingness of bitterness and sorrowful silence. We don't actually know much about what they were doing or saying during the time between Jesus' burial and the first day of the week when they got the news that something unexplainable had happened. But we can imagine. Can you imagine? We've all lost friends or loved ones in the wake of death that rocked us to our core. Now imagine not only losing a teacher, a leader, a friend, but the one who provided the most compelling case for the answer to the world's sorrow, suffering, injustice, hypocrisy, abuse of power, addiction, and evil. Jesus was the one who seemed to be able to back down all the evil powers into utter submissiveness. Now he's gone. Before Easter. So no, there was no party vibe whatsoever in those hours before the supernatural event that changed everything. But then the unthinkable happened. And so the question I have, secondly, is what is the party like when God does the impossible? What kind of party do you throw in an event like this? How do you celebrate something so unexpected that there are no rules on the back of the cupcake box for appropriate party preparations? You know what I'm talking about? There is not a Google search for what kind of party to throw when someone comes back to life after being dead for a few days. Actual bodily resurrection is almost too much for us to handle emotionally, mentally, and perhaps even spiritually. It's just mind-blowing. So the tomb encounter that Christine read for us a little earlier for the ladies that Luke highlights is recorded in Luke 24, 1 through 12. And it's pretty clear that those ladies did not expect to see an empty tomb, did they? They were going to the tomb to do what the ancient Jewish people did in that day, to care for and to honor the deceased. We perhaps have other ways of showing care for someone who has passed away. We may bring flowers to their grave on a certain day of the year. We may carry something they once treasured with us. But in the end, we're all doing the same thing, trying to remember them as they were when they were living, attempting to reach back in time and draw them close again, even if just for a moment in our memories. And that's what these ladies were doing. They were attempting to feel the closeness, the love, the wisdom, the compassion, and the presence they had experienced with Jesus and so recently lived in. And now it was gone forever, and here they were at the break of dawn on Sunday morning, going to visit the dead body of Jesus, the dead and buried Jesus, but then something unexpected happened. You see, they were wondering who would roll the stone away so they could attend to Jesus' dead body. But when they arrived, the stone was already rolled to the side. This, of course, didn't compute for them, doesn't make sense to them. Did someone steal Jesus' body? How unthinkable, how terrible, what should we do? You see, often like the ladies, we're asking the wrong questions too. They felt like the great obstacle for the day was a barricade. Who would roll the stone away? That was their big task for the day. That was the big crisis of the day. But that question actually wouldn't matter once God did what he was going to do. They were coming with a very practical concern, the obstacle that stood in the way of their good-hearted activity. Their hearts were sincere and well-meaning, but they didn't have all the information yet. They hadn't yet readjusted their mindset, their way of life, their worship to the new situation. They came to remember and honor and attend to the dead body of their rabbi, but they should have come to have a party for their Lord. And this brings up the question again about resurrection parties. What does a true, once-and-for-all resurrection party look like? Or another way of saying it, how do you celebrate when God does the impossible? When death is defeated, when sin is atoned for, when God ushers in a new way of being for humans in and through the power of his own Son, what does that party look like? Well, perhaps the angels who talk to the ladies lay out for us a vibe of what this resurrection party looks like, and it looks something like this. It's a fearless party. Remember what they said to them? Don't be afraid. It's a party where there's no fear. The next thing they said was, don't seek the living among the dead. It's a come and see party. It's a party where there's object lessons. There's a stone that's been rolled away. There's grave clothes. They're lying in the grave. There's an empty tomb. This has always been the way it has been with Christianity as we've thought about what it means to be a Christian. It has to do with the resurrected body of Jesus, and it's always been a come and see event. This is why when Paul is breaking out the gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, one of the key things he says is that it was testified by over 500 people. Jesus' closest disciples and over 500 people were eyewitnesses to the bodily resurrection of Jesus. They actually touched Jesus. They saw Jesus. And that, by the way, is why the fish thing is in there. Did you ever wonder, why does the text say he ate broiled fish? Seems kind of anticlimactic. It is. However, if you think about it, if Jesus could eat fish like a normal person, then his body was a resurrected body and not a spiritual body. He could literally eat what everybody else was eating. That's one of the reasons that little detail is in there. It's a come and see party where these hundreds of people testified to Jesus' body out of the grave. They touched him, they saw him, and now they have told us, and we tell people, and that's the next part about this party. This resurrection party is a go and tell others about it kind of party. That's what the angel said. Now go and tell the disciples what's happened here. This resurrection party must be related to other humans that will listen, because the truth is that all of us are in the same spot. We are all gripped by fear, sorrow, anger, and doubt, and we need to hear the story, because if it's true, it makes a world of difference. It makes the world and our part in it just different, full of meaning, hope, and joy. So a resurrection party really is the greatest party in the history of the world, because it breaks out when Jesus triumphs over death and evil by the way of the historic event in which God raised Jesus back to life. And isn't it interesting that this party doesn't begin with the power brokers or the celebrities or the rich and famous or the superstars, but with Jesus' confused friends? The initial resurrection party wasn't really even a party. It was an announcement about a great event, a great party to come. It's at this moment that when the ladies were first confronted with the living Jesus, that this part should have begun to make sense to them. The actual party was being suspended. This is how the text works. We see the narrative go right to the couple of significant after parties. Do you understand what I'm saying? Jesus raises from the grave, and actually, there was no party. Did you get this? There was a series of after parties, but the question is, where's the party? And the answer is, it's been suspended. It's been floated. Have you ever floated your kids' or grandkids' party because you forgot or something? Like, we're floating that one. This is actually what happened to the greatest event the world has ever known. The party has been suspended, and instead, there's all these little after parties taking place. This is how the gospel writers narrate this movement. It doesn't make sense to us. But here's what I think the writers want us to see. The after parties with Jesus were so ordinary. Ordinary enough to offer Jesus broiled fish. And I know I keep harping on that, but it disturbs me. How much more ordinary can you get? Nobody wants to eat broiled fish anyway. But how much more ordinary can it be to have an after party where Jesus is sitting with his closest friends in confusion, in disbelief? They're freaking out because they thought he might be a ghost. They want to touch him. And then he's sitting there eating fish with them. Jesus is walking and talking and eating with his followers. This is what we see in the road to Emmaus as well. It's kind of like this little after party. It seems so ordinary that these Jewish dudes he's walking with don't even know that they're at an after party with him until they sit down with him and he begins to break the bread. And the Bible says their eyes were opened and they recognized him and he disappeared. It was just so ordinary. They didn't even know that they were sitting with the resurrected Jesus. Can you imagine coming in and sitting down and grabbing some bread and drink? And they don't even know they're sitting with the King of Kings who has conquered death. That's how ordinary it was. Jesus wasn't doing magic tricks and he wasn't glowing and doing tricks, walking in and out of the walls and stuff. He was just sitting with them eating like friends. It was ordinary. And I think that's what the gospel writers want us to see. There's no fanfare. There's no Nazareth high school marching band. There's no confetti. There's no ball drop. There's no F-16 flyby. Because, my friends, the big actual party is on standby. While for the church, the after parties continue. Do you know that that's what this actually is? This is an after party in view of the actual party to come. That is, the conversations and the celebrations about the ongoing significance of the greatest day in the world continue leading up to the big actual party when God sets all things right. Why is it like this? After party first, then the big resurrection party at the end. Well, here's why. Because Jesus' followers and friends were fragile and hurting. So Jesus spends the next 40 days caring for them like a good shepherd. Don't you think that's what's needed? Sometimes the last thing we need is a party. We just need somebody to care for us. And that's exactly what Jesus did for his followers. I think it's set up like this because Jesus' followers and friends needed to be convinced that Jesus was actually alive because they were wrestling with their own doubts and fears. After all, they had been his eyewitnesses for the expansion of his kingdom into all the world, and they thought he had died, and now here he is, and they would be called on again to expand, to be his expanders for the kingdom into all the world. So he spends real time with them, talking, touching, walking, and eating with them. And then also, Jesus' followers need to understand that the scriptures and his own prophetic word makes sense of the events of his death so they can explain this to others. How are they going to explain to others if they're still drowning in their own doubt and fear? So he spends 40 days with them, encouraging them. So here's how I see this. The greatest event the world has ever known has a party that has been floated to the end of the ages. We get a feel for this in the book of Revelation. Someday we'll do a whole series through the book of Revelation, and then we'll really blow your minds. So for the church now, we celebrate this coming party by faith and in advance of the actual party. That is our Sunday worship, every Sunday, by the way. They're kind of like ongoing after parties caring for the fragile and the confused. This is what we do every Sunday. We don't just get up here and sing and celebrate like everything's great, because the reality is it's not. You know how I know? Because you're humans. And you know how I know also? Because it's not all perfect with me. You know why? Because I'm a human, which means I'm broken. Maybe more than you are. Probably. So, remembering Jesus' death, singing and praying in light of all that God has done in Jesus, as we wait for him to fix the mess of things we've made, once a year we celebrate this and we try to recreate the coming party. That's what happens on Easter Sunday. That's why it's a little bit special, because on Easter Sunday we're trying to recreate the party to come in the new heavens and new earth. So this is our worship party. You might say, anticipating the final return of Jesus in his great apocalyptic party called the marriage supper of the Lamb that we see in the book of Revelation. So the greatest party is yet to come. It's for the greatest act of love that's already been achieved. And the after parties, let's be honest, they're somewhat ordinary. Even if the first ones did have a couple of vanishing moments by Jesus, they were still ordinary with fish. And this is the huge point, I think, about the after parties that we're still living in. The ordinary way of Jesus after parties. You could say that in this life, the followers of Jesus are living the ordinary way of Jesus that comes quietly and beautifully and powerfully out of the meaning of his resurrection. Even if today is a more celebratory, happy, purpley, and flowery day, the resurrection after party is really quite normal, quite messy, ordinary, loving, wise. It's about living out this way of Jesus, living out the resurrection story of Jesus on our way to the biggest party the world has ever known. Amen. Would you back